But I guess the key thing is for our industry is most people here would be aware is traceability is really the enabler of so many of these things. So you can probably go to the next screen. I'll go through this relatively quickly. So in terms of when you think recycling and traceability, the big question is why? Why do we need traceability in recycling? We have it in a lot of other sectors, but why do we really need it in recycling? So I'll go to the next slide. As Matt was saying, there's a fair amount of recycling that historically has been shipped overseas, and that's not just an Australian thing, that's a global thing. A lot of developed countries have been shipping mainly plastics offshore for recycling. And so the big question is, where does it go? And I guess what I want to step through now is what are the 6 reasons why we need to know. So the first one, if you can go to the next slide, and this sort of follows on from what Matt was saying, it's all about the environment. The key issue is what's the environmental damage that's being caused. So if you look at those images, they speak very clearly, louder than words. Everyone would have heard of the plastics patch in the Pacific. So that's the island the size of Texas floating in the Pacific of plastics. The top right image there is actually a river or a creek somewhere in Asia. So that's not on the ground, that is plastics floating. So 80% of the world's ocean plastics are coming from rivers and coastlines. It's estimated that over 80% of ocean plastics are coming from Asian river systems. If you include sub-Saharan Africa, that number jumps to about 95% of ocean plastics are coming from those regions. And if you go to the bottom, the quote down the bottom side there, the bottom right hand, you can see that they're estimating 60 to 90% of ocean plastics come from only 10 rivers. So when there's so much, when these third world countries are struggling with their own waste management systems, and you've got the developed countries pouring their waste in there or their recycling, their plastic recycling in for processing, those systems are certainly struggling, and there's a risk that it ends up in the ocean. Back in last year, the World Economic Forum did some calculations, and what they're estimating is up to 7% of the PET that the EU sends for recycling ends up in the ocean. No, sorry, it's 7% of the PET that they manufacture ends up in the ocean, and roughly about a third of all their exports aren't being recycled. So, and this is a really key need for traceability, because if you're a ratepayer, if you're industry and you're paying for that recycling, you need to ensure that it is being recycled. So that last point there is something that was called out at the Sustainable Development Impact Summit, that technologies that enable traceability will help create a circular economy. So the second point, and Matt's already referred to this one, is also food safety. Most people on this call would be aware that in the food industry, for the case of a recall, you need to be able to trace your food ingredients, not only from paddock to plate, but from plate back to paddock. So in the event of a recall, that you know where the materials have come from, where in the supply chain they have been. So as we increase the recycled content percentage of packaging, we need to make sure that we know where the recycled content has been as well, because it is going to be increasingly coming into contact with foodstuffs. So so the scrutiny we have on food traceability now more importantly needs to, or as equally importantly, needs to apply to recycling traceability. So I'll go to the next slide. I've only got a few more. And this is another one that Matt sort of referred to, is we need to prevent greenwashing. Currently, there's a global shortage of post-consumer recycled content on plastics. And so if anyone is looking for that to achieve their packaging targets, you've got to pay a premium. So you need to be able to validate the claims that that packaging actually is recycled content, and you're not being sold virgin content masquerading as recycled content. The government also earlier this year released the National Plastics Plan. So if you look on the bottom right, you'll see there's a target there for 80% of supermarket products to have the Australian Cycling logo or label on pack by the end of 2023. And the underlined bits there states including the recycled content. So the government's expectation of brands is to put the ARL on, but also to indicate the recycled content. So before you can do that, The packaging industry needs to have confidence that they're actually buying recycled content, and then they need to be able to mass balance that over the period of a year, so a brand owner can put that on their packaging with confidence and not breach any ACCC regulations, because you have to be able, if you don't have the proof that it's recycled content, you'll be making a false claim. So it's really critical. That is a real precedent for brand owners, that there needs to be full traceability now through the packaging supply chain and the recycling supply chain. We go to the next slide. Number 4, the fourth reason, again, and Matt mentioned the Product Stewardship Investment Fund. So about a year ago, the government released a fund, a $20 million fund for product stewardship, to create new or expand existing product stewardship schemes. So to date, I think it's now up to about 23 or 24 schemes have been funded. I'm not sure the money invested, but it's be well over $15 million of that fund has now been invested. They've also created the Product Stewardship Centre of Excellence. And one of the key things, and this comes from my learnings working with the development of container deposit schemes, is you need to be able to trace the material movements through the supply chain. In product stewardship, either the community or industry funds these programs, and therefore you need proof that the money you're spending on recycling actually drives recycling. So it's really critical that there's transparency right through product stewardship schemes. It's also to prevent fraud. The classic case is aluminium in a container deposit scheme. If you add up what's in a bale of aluminium or a ton of aluminium, it sells for about $1,100 a ton, but the value of the refund amount per bale is somewhere closer to $12,000 to $14,000. So you've got to make sure those bales don't come through the systems 2 or 3 times, and therefore you need traceability to prevent and catch any fraud. And probably the most important is on the next slide, and I think a picture tells 1,000 words on this one, is responsible sourcing. It's something that's probably not thought of a lot in the whole discussion. The whole discussion is centered around recycling, but I think every company has an obligation to ensure that we're not perpetuating things like this. So to prevent this in the future, the government's introduced the waste export ban. So on plastics, that means from the 1st of July this year, any plastic being sent offshore cannot be mixed. So you can't send PET with HDPE with polypropylene. They now have to be sorted by polymer. And in a year's time, you'll know that no one will be able to ship whole bottles. They'll have to be washed, flaked, pelletized with traceability before they can be exported. So that's absolutely key. Also, for any company, no matter where you are in the supply chain, if you've got a turnover greater than $100 million, you'll need this traceability for your modern slavery reporting to call out, such as you can see on the screen. So it's to really phase out, to locate and phase out cases of modern slavery. One more slide, and I'll finish up there, is really to ensure there's and restore community trust. There's been a lot of media headlines, such as those you can see there, of waste that people have taken it to the curb, they've source separated, they've put it in their bins with the expectation that a bottle is going to return to it, recycled and return to another bottle. To see images like this really undermines confidence in the recycling sector. So to have traceability, to keep the community engaged in a positive manner, because when you've got a positive engaged community, they'll source separate, it reduces the contamination, therefore increases the quality, and therefore increases the recyclability of the packaging. So one more slide. So really just in summary, they're the 6 reasons why we're very keen to see traceability right through the supply chain, trace and prevent environmental damage, stop the greenwashing and certify recycled content for on-pack labelling. For food safety, it's absolutely critical, it's not negotiable. Phase out and report modern slavery, and to identify and prevent fraud, and finally restore trust in communities' trust in the recycling system.